Terence Pell speaking for the motion. It's time to end affirmative action.
Thank you. Look, for the last 40 years, America has been engaged in a massive social experiment to see whether the use of racial preferences could bring about the full integration of American society. The question tonight is whether these preferential policies can deliver on that promise. And the question need not be abstract, nor need it divide liberals and conservatives. That's because in the last decade, a growing body of data has become available that helps us get a handle on the trade-off between attending an elite institution on the basis of different admission standards or attending a less prestigious institution. Let's start with the effect of racial preferences in undergraduate colleges. I'm going to focus on one specific academic area, namely science. Not many minority students enter science, and many who do drop out along the way. Blacks receive about 5.3% of the bachelor's degrees in science, despite making up about 9% of the college enrollment. Well, research into these disparities by Dartmouth psychologist Rogers Elliott provides a template of the kinds of questions we should be asking, not just in the area of science, but in every area where preferential policies are employed, because it turns out that the preferences themselves are part of the problem. The first thing that Elliott's data does is dispel the assumption that non-Asian minority students somehow aren't interested in science. In fact, high-achieving Black and Hispanic high school seniors are more interested in majoring in science than whites. The second thing the data tells us is that the really elite research universities, the schools that recruit the most promising students, Black and white, use significant racial preferences to enroll the most gifted and talented Black and Hispanic undergraduates. Elliott's 1997 study, which focused on 4 Ivy League schools, found that the mean SAT math score for Black students was 100 points below that of white students. That difference was about 1.6 times this, 1.6 standard deviations of the white scores. This means that the Black mean was not only below the white mean, it was so far below the white mean that the majority of Black students had scores in the bottom 10% of the distribution of scores of all students. Now, right away, this significant use of race preferences by the most elite schools is significant. The fact that the very top schools that have their pick of the best students are using preferences of this magnitude suggests that the next tier of schools are likely using greater preferences. And in fact, second-tier schools do use greater preferences, about 15% larger than those used by the top schools. As a consequence, many Black and Hispanic students up and down the line are attending schools where their credentials are significantly out of line with those of their classmates. Well, one possible response at this point, and we may hear this later on tonight, is to say that the SAT math score doesn't fairly measure Black academic success. One could even deny that admitting Black students with lower SAT math scores amounts to a preference. Well, we could debate this all night, but the research on this point is undisputed. If anything, grades and SAT scores overpredict Black performance. So admitting Blacks and Hispanics with significantly lower test scores and grades makes it all but certain that Blacks and Hispanics as a group will get lower grades in college. And that's just what Elliott found. Blacks interested in science at these schools had grades almost a full GPA lower than whites. For many students, many minority students, this made it difficult to continue in science, and Elliott found that only a third of the Blacks who started in science at elite schools completed a degree in science. The rest switched majors or dropped out altogether, and this rate was twice the rate of white students at those schools. Second, the lower grades of those who did finish disadvantaged them significantly, both in going on to graduate school and getting jobs. Well, if the story ended here, you might think that test score gaps make it highly unlikely that Blacks will ever, or a significant number of Blacks will ever succeed in science. This would be a very dreary conclusion if it were true, but the fact is it's not true. This is where the data tells us something very interesting that helps us get a handle on the real problem with preferential policies, because it turns out that the absolute value of a student's math SAT score and high school grades is less important as the relative difference between one's credentials and those of his or her classmates. How do we know this? Well, it turns out that black students interested in science who attend schools where their math SAT scores more closely match that of other students persist in science at much higher rates, even though the average SAT scores at these schools is lower. So for example, Howard University, a historically black college, has average SAT math scores of about 450, well below the mean of the SAT score at the elite schools we've been discussing. Yet Howard is the top producer of black undergraduate science and engineering degrees in the country. What's more, a large percentage of undergraduate science majors at Howard and other historically black colleges go on to get PhDs in science. Of the top 21 undergraduate producers of black PhDs in the country, 17 of them, 17 of the 21, are historically black colleges, and none are among the 30 or so most selective schools that routinely recruit the most talented black high school students. And so what we have is this perverse system. The institutions with the poorest track records for producing black PhDs in science are getting the best minority students and then driving them out of science at twice the rate of white students. And the institutions with the best track record are getting the middling students and then producing the overwhelming majority of black PhDs in science. Well, what lessons can we draw from this? First, the existence of racial inequalities in society, which nobody on this side of the table denies, is not a sufficient justification for preferential policies. It's bad enough that African Americans are so substantially underrepresented in science. It's completely inexcusable that racial preferences end up frustrating and discouraging the gifted black high school seniors who say they want to study science. Second, it is misleading to evaluate racial preferences in the abstract, as if we're talking about one or two institutions that use preferences in a handful of deserving cases. What we're dealing with, the problem that we've got, is the systematic use of racial preferences by every single institution of higher education in the country. I've used my time to focus on one specific problem in some detail, but a growing body of research shows similar effects in many other areas. Surely all of us can agree that schools should be required to publish graduation rates and grade distributions, and yes, persistence in majors, broken down according to the different preferences granted, and that means all of them, including racial preferences, alumni preferences, and athletic preferences. The problem is the same in all cases. But more fundamentally, we need to ask ourselves why we tolerate the systematic use of race preferences. Every Supreme Court precedent in this area has held that racial preferences are a last resort, yet schools continue to treat preferences as a sacred cow they must defend to the death. Thank you.